Welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. My name is Austin Chadwick. Co-host is Chris Lucian. Very excited today to have Eli Goodman to talk about tools for mob programming, the effect of mobbing on team and culture, and Tuple. But first off, we're going to have Eli introduce himself, and he's got some questions for us. So should be a fun conversation. But before we jump into those questions, Eli, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So my name is Eli Goodman. My title is Head of Product, and I work for Tuple, which is a tool that facilitates remote mob and pair programming. Previous to working at Tuple, I've worked with technology for, I guess, approaching 17 years now. Makes me feel very old. But I've worked in a wide variety of roles. Started my career as an IC developer, so mostly back-end and web stuff. I worked for Etsy when it was a small company and saw it go from little to big. I've also worked for Headspace, the meditation app, saw it go from little to big, so worked as a developer there. But also throughout my career, I've had the opportunity to do engineering management stuff. So I've been an EM, I've been a director of engineering, I've been the CTO of a small startup. And then most recently have had the opportunity to move into product management roles. So I was the product lead for another small startup and have had the good fortune to now become Tuple's head of product, which is such a fun job. So I'm excited to be here talking about pairing and mobbing because I think about it all day, every day now.
Welcome to the club. Yes.
Fascinating.
Nice.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you had some questions for us. So go ahead and shoot. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. So I was telling you guys before we started recording, but I know this is a little bit atypical on a podcast where I'm the guest and not the host. But even though I'm passionate about pairing and mobbing now, I am relatively new on Tuple. I joined in January, so there's a lot that I don't know. And again, as head of product, I sort of think of it as my job to learn as much as I possibly can about pairing and mobbing, especially from you two, who are veritable experts in the field. So I figure I kind of selfishly want to use this time to talk to you guys about how you do pairing and mobbing. So I figured maybe the first thing that I would love to learn about is before we get really general, maybe start with like a tangible example for both of you. Like just tell me about the last session you were both a part of. I'd love to learn more about, the last session that comes to mind. And I'll ask you some questions to dig in, but I don't know which one of you guys wants to go first.
Austin, why don't you go ahead and then I'll...
Yeah. Last session was 13 minutes ago before this recording. Yeah, we mobbed for the morning. It was 3 people total, including myself. And we were working on IoT cloud communications related to irrigation. And so, yeah. What would you like to know?
So you say we were mobbing for the morning. So how long was the session? When did you start? When did you stop?
Yes. So we started at 7 a.m. Pacific time. We used to start at 8 a.m. Pacific time, but there's a new member of kind of the broader team who is in a different time zone. So we started mobbing earlier. And then it went from 7 a.m. until noon. So what is that? 5 hours, but with breaks every hour following a timer Pomodoro technique. So yeah.
Cool. Okay. So is that a typical duration for you? And is that a typical setup to use a Pomodoro timer to create breaks and create structure like that?
Yeah. I think it's very typical for me. And I think while each mob at our organization is different, like how Chris says, they're each like a boutique. They each come up with their own principles and processes and things. I think that is fairly common amongst them. So maybe it's like we all use the same lighting in our boutique or something. So
there's some things that are common. Yeah.
Maybe so like I hop from mob to mob. And so I very much kind of have different, I kind of see all the different techniques. So you certainly have most of our teams are mobbing in with like a 4 hours, like 4 to 5 hour time period, kind of lunch in between, so that all looks very similar. Cadence of retrospectives, cadence of stand-ups, other things along the other rituals are different. And then also, I think culturally speaking, the mobs are very different, just depending on their style. I think we did an episode on the the Zen mobbing versus high octane mobbing that Austin's very fond of. And there's so there's certainly very culturally and situationally, contextually different things that pop up depending on which mob you're on. Levels of like XP fervor versus levels of lean, agile, and other things like that. So you can have everything from a much less experienced mob kind of getting used to these sorts of things to a very experienced mob, or what you see most often is like a gradient of skill levels, like senior, mid, junior, something in between, and working through things together like that.
Yeah. So, Austin, for the mob that you were just a part of, I personally am hearing the term, what is it, Zen to high octane spectrum, but I think I know what that means. Austin, for the one you were just in, where did it fall in the Zen high octane spectrum?
I feel like it's kind of square in the middle.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not rowdy and lots of what I want to say, kind interruptions. The very high octane kind of style, and debates, like in kind of in your face debates, but it's not highly synchronized and highly consensus based. So there's yeah, so I think it's kind of in the middle. Yep.
Cool. And then I'm curious. So, Chris, you just mentioned that you jump from mob to mob. So in your organization, are mobs like largely stable units that have like, stable membership? Like, Austin, for the people you were mobbing with, is this a group that you mob with before, or is this like, are you also kind of jumping from flower to flower? Like, how does that sort of membership and stability work?
Well, yeah. So I guess the first part of it is so no one in our department is allowed to be on a team for more than 2 years. So you are likely, if you're with the company for longer than 2 years, you will end up working with somebody different on a different mob. And that rule was kind of put in place just because there was like some level of stagnation that we kind of figured was not appropriate, but other than that, generally speaking, anybody can move to any team whenever they want to, and as long as it's budgeted for. So it's all budgetary constraints. So we're saying we want so many people hours on a particular product, and so but then there aren't really many rules beyond that. So there's no requirement to mob, but the only hard line rule is that at least 2 pairs of eyes must review all code going to production. And so, or 2 sets of eyes, I guess. And so I think the effect of that is that there are times where people do solo and code review with the mob that they're on. We typically refer to teams as mobs because I think culturally speaking, it is very normal for us. But there are pairs that happen. There are individual contribution that happens. It's just very, very rare. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm sort of this may come up more in the conversation, but I'm kind of a linguistic nerd, and I tend to really fixate on little tiny word choices. And I think it's fascinating that your internal notion of a team is called a mob. Like to me, that is very telling though, right? And it has a different connotation, right?
Yeah.
Where it does feel like you're a group that synchronously is together often. Because when you were saying it, I also wasn't sure if the teams you were on and the mobs you participated in were like orthogonal, and it sounds like they're one and the same. Is that right?
Yeah. So I think recently we've talked about a little bit about the inverse Conway maneuver, and we have an episode on that as well. But I think that lately we've been making a effort to essentially split the work along a vertical delivery stream. So, rather than, doing things in horizontal slices like database, middle tier, front end, we're delivering in thin vertical slices, and we try to make the requirement for team communication to hit the smallest number of people, like the unit of a mob. And then that makes stand-ups with a product owner very, very short. Or if product, sometimes product owners are embedded into the team. And so we have seen, that, no need for a stand-up because the product owner is already aligned. And so, but again, it's like culturally different depending on which team you go to. We do, in the past we have talked about teams and mobs kind of separately, but for a group that regularly works on code together, yeah, typically it's referred to as a mob.
Cool. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
And then Austin, in your most recent mobbing session, how much of the 5 hours was actually writing code or doing technical work, and how much of it was like conversation or discussion?
Yeah, so we started the morning. I missed the last hour of the mobbing the day before because my kid had a baseball game in a kind of a distant park. And then so they were filling me in on the spike. They were basically doing some experimental code to have a uniqueness for basically a connection ID. And so they shared that with me, and then we actually asked AI a bunch of questions. They already asked one AI bot a bunch of questions, so then we asked another one for a second opinion. So we asked a series of questions, making, basically exploring different options. So I would say about the first hour and a half was research together with a light code experimentation. And then we had like 6 different options, and then we picked one. And then I think the last 4 hours we were TDDing it into existence. And then before lunch, we were cleaning up some of that. So, yeah.
Cool. So sort of that paints a really clear sort of arc of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, that I just smiled real big at we were all asking an AI a bunch of questions. That to me is sort of conceptually fascinating, right? Where it's like, and again, I apologize again if this is well-trod territory on your show, but like,
yeah,
it feels like the inclusion of non-human intelligences into the mob is like something I find personally fascinating. And again, if we get to the part where I talk more about Tuple, this is something that I'm thinking a lot about in my professional capacity, because AI is the thing now. Everyone's into it, and it feels like there feels like there's something there. You know what I mean? So I don't know. Just using my spidey sense, it's really interesting to see that as a place where you all got together and all lobbed questions at the LLM, and it's research, putting in under air quotes, but that's very cool. I love that.
yeah, it was a good time. Yeah.
Nice. And then Chris, what was your last mobbing session? Just so I
Yeah,
just
kind of given my role within the group, I'll mob for shorter durations, and then but I will mob on, far more teams, here and there.
He's our leader, so he's got big honcho things to do,
So. Important stuff.
Yeah, so I'll be sitting in meetings a lot more. But yeah, so I guess with a team that was exploring a way to kind of communicate with kind of long used protocols that I had some contextual knowledge on. I joined the team. We got into the rotation, and kind of gradually it was a little bit more of like a knowledge sharing session, but we still went through kind of a TDD process, and kind of looking at the code together, and then exploring alternative options and other ideas, and so it's just kind of like join the team for a little while and then kind of give the feedback and opinions on direction a lot. And yeah, so it was a lot of just like, at first I would get at the keyboard, what do we do here, what are we doing, go ahead and give me some lower level navigation, and then gradually over time get some context, and then shift to like, okay, well, this is what I think of what I've seen so far, and maybe here's some things to consider. What was really cool is, I came back, or I attended their stand up like a week later. And the kind of the outcome of that was a kind of a shift to a more like lean focused delivery. So it was really cool. And they had kind of done that based on the feedback and had got it all working by the time I heard about it again. So yeah.
Nice. That's really cool. And And so I'm curious, like you already mentioned that you jump around. It sounds like you're in a leadership position. I like one of the things that I'm curious about with respect to mob programming is just like the general idea of like protocols and practices. Like you've already mentioned the Pomodoro technique or the Pomodoro timer and the 1 hour breaks. Like I'm curious, Chris, like are there things that you pick up from some teams and introduce to other teams? Like do you see that as part of your remit? And I'm curious, like what things have traveled well and what things tend to really be like, oh, this is the only mob that does this.
Yeah. Well, so we rely heavily on the diffusion of innovation theory. So this idea that, if it's really good, it will spread. And uh, we also have kind of like this, what we call the traveling coaches, traveling visitors program, where, generally speaking, we do have time set aside for people to join another team and observe that team, either in a coaching perspective or as a visitor. And that has kind of accelerated knowledge sharing between the groups. And a lot of people come out, I sent out a feedback survey, and people coming out of that saying, I learned a lot from this team, even though I was trying to give them critical feedback. And so it's really cool. And so typically it's like those things that kind of spread like wildfire, really. And especially I think if somebody puts like a lot of effort into preparing for it, sometimes it's accelerated. So like one thing I'm thinking about is database continuous integration. So, a lot of developers practice continuous integration, but then they're like, we just have to roll forward our database. We have no way of rolling back. We have no way of like actually incrementing on our schema. And so a lot of teams continuously deliver their server side and front end, but don't do database migrations through their CI system. And so one of our developers, we have 7 hours of dedicated learning time a week for the teams. And one of our developers spent a lot of that time just learning database continuous integration systems themselves. And then they brought it back to the team, demoed it, and then also did a mob learning session during that learning time, or a number of. And then the next time they went to make a database change, they're just like, okay, we already know this. Let's just stand it up. And so those typically become very successful in spreading from team to team. And so eventually every team was doing something like that. Similarly with like the large language models and using them in the mob, I think that was one team. Austin was on that team while they were doing those things. And then gradually as people visited their team, they're like, oh, wow, this is like really interesting what you're doing here. And then they bring it back to their team and try it out there. And so you can kind of see like when a practice crosses the chasm. I think things that are like that don't crossover. I mean, we've even had like half the department doing a practice and half the department not doing it. And so I think it largely has to do with the, personalities and historic context of everyone on that team. But things that die pretty quickly are like, maybe enforced policies across every group or things like that. I would just say in general, it really is like a, right tool for the job sort of thing. And is it memeable, more or less? Because we do have monthly lightning talks as well. And so the entire department is forced to listen to you for 5 minutes, so you can pretty much put whatever idea you want in there. And sometimes those things can spread very, very quickly across the teams, like maybe a new retrospective format or some new way of like managing the work or other things like that.
Yeah, I mean that's wonderful to hear about. And again, this probably goes to that saying, but it sounds like you were saying that the requirements for something spreading, memeability and quality, right? But also you have to have the actual substrate that something can travel through, right? And it sounds like your organization has taken great pains to create dense and heterogeneous webs of interconnection. Like one of the interesting things when I first joined Tuple, a bunch of folks had been working on like a visualization for pairing and mobbing, right? And so you could just see who had paired most with who, and it had weighted edges. And it was really fascinating to see certain organizations that was like a big circle where everyone was just talking to everybody else, and others that had these like little islands
Yep.
And again, I can't generalize enough from like what those companies were like, but it was jarring to see organizations of similar size, and some were dense and some weren't. And it sounds like, you all have really reaped the benefit of that, intentional dense interconnection, because it's allowed these positive development practices to spread.
Yeah, I think we get people, and every once in a while we'll get a visitor or something, and they'll say, wow, it's like I really want to be doing everything you're doing right now, and so a lot of times I say, remember, like we started as a waterfall shop, and we gradually got here, and it was all incremental over the last 10, 12 years now. And so so often it is very much just a one thing at a time, or maybe a few ideas spreading within the group. But that the kind of the intentional sharing, cross-pollination techniques that we're using allow those ideas to spread very quickly. And the diffusion of innovation theory it's all very evolutionary model driven. And so I'm a big fan of evolutionary algorithms with like binary recombination, genetic sort of stuff. And so a lot of the times I think about that, like, if a single team is an organism, and you cross-pollinate between them, then you get like, new generations, and then those generations have, better or worse performance, and then those things propagate from generation to generation. And so if you look at it that way, then the evolution of the practices will generally move the needle in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, preaching to the choir, I don't have as much formal knowledge about it, but conceptually I'm way on board. And like, what better place to source inspiration from than nature herself?
Yeah.
So, I'm into it. So I'm curious, given that it seems like mobbing is such a pervasive cultural practice, are there situations that arise in the course of doing development where you all are like, we should not mob on this? Like, this is something for so and so to like go into the broom closet and have complete isolation and go deep on this? Like, or is it more of a like every day has a big mobbing session, every problem comes into that mobbing session? Like, how do you think about something like that?
So I have one story on this, but I wanted to hear from
Yeah.
Austin and see if he had any situations that he feels like that's appropriate. But
Yeah, I think in my experience, it's just been very organic. So someone's just like, hey, I really want to go experiment on this on my own, and be like, okay, cool. And so either they drop from the remote call, or they're still on it, but they're just doing their own thing and out of the driver navigator rotation kind of thing. And then they come back either with big discoveries, or better questions, or let's try this or that, or they have a solution and let's vet it. But I think since we tend to hire people who want to mob, it's not like, hey, I'm gonna go alone for a year and then come back kind of thing. It's like more often hours. There was one individual who would do it for days, maybe a week. Actually a couple of people I knew who would do that. It was mostly R&D. It was like a really hard problem, something they were really passionate about, that they wanted to go figure out on their own. So yeah, it's been more organic like that. And typically, usually I think we tend to work on things together, because the automationist will rise, and if we're doing redundant stuff as a mob, it'll get automated. So that'll usually arise out of it. And so all that's left is hard problems that takes multiple minds and multiple parts of the system. So what's your story though, Chris? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I'll second what you're saying about the research. So I do, there are times where you just need like speedy breadth first, searching of the problem space, right? And so you might even all split up and try some different experiment that can be communicating. And so that might be, lots of people on the same call, like, spreading out. So I do see that from time to time, especially if it's just like a lot of like trial and error, and you just don't know how to get a working prototype going. Then that can be, you get a lot faster iteration sometimes. But the story I'm thinking about is, when we first started mobbing in the first place, we developed a good cadence, and we were experimenting frequently, delivering often, things like that, like all the different things that we wanted to see. And what was really and then we were asked to like help another team, but not automate any of the things that we were going to do. And so it was a really strange scenario. But what kind of came out of it was an interesting thing. So like, I believe that if you do something over and over again, then you're going to want to automate it, right? And automating something will, I think benefits from the multiple perspectives of a mob. But when a problem space is so simple or repetitive in some way, then it will feel very painful to mob. And so in that scenario where we told not to automate the work that we were doing and instead to go in like one by one and change things, we just said it is not a valuable use of our time to be mobbing right now. Let's split up. But what you really would have done was just create a generator for that, or just automate the creation of that. Use the JetBrains tool, the JetBrains templates, or something along those lines, where it's just like pop out the code. And so it was really, it was kind of telling. So that kind of led me to believe that probably like the mob ensemble teaming format is probably generally better for you in the long term if you are working on something novel, right? And so because again, you get to test all the different aspects and everything like that. But and then you look at the flip side of that. If it's boring and repetitive, then you would automate it, which would then be novel, right? And so so generally speaking, I think that the people that are saying no, I'm faster, not mobbing, you can totally argue with me in the comments. This is just like my hot take.
Please do
Rage
argue
on
with
me,
Chris.
please.
Yeah.
But if you are, if you go to work solo and you feel like this is the most effective way, then my question is there some level of abstraction, especially if you feel faster because you're just typing faster? Is there a level of abstraction that's missing, or is there some level of repetition that we've accepted into our lives that we don't really realize is actually costing us a lot? So that's kind of my the brain teaser that I throw out to people. It's like, why does it feel faster? Is it really that it is faster, or is, from a quality delivery standpoint, feature delivery standpoint, or is it the question of this idea of like, is there something that we missed automating, right?
Yeah, no, this is something I'm like rocking as you're both talking, just like the union of mobbing and this predilection towards automation, right? Because I know in experiences for myself, if I got to get something done and you're by yourself, you will be okay with copying, pasting, and doing all kinds of unautomated kind of repetitive stuff to meet your goal. But if you've got a lot of brains in the room who can help you reason through what would be a better either abstraction or tool, and then you can distribute that work a little bit more, like I can totally see that becomes more available in situations when it wouldn't otherwise. So that's a light bulb turning on for me personally. So thanks for lighting it up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious now, as like a little bit of a segue to one of our planned topics. I'm curious what tools you do use. So when you are, how do you talk to each other? Are you typing on each other's computers? Does everyone have their own desktop going? Like how does collaboration happening? What are all the tools you're bringing to bear on a typical mobbing session?
Nice. Yeah. So the short answer is, again, each mob is their own boutique and they have tried different things.
Yeah.
But what's very common is audio video over Teams or Zoom, but most common Teams. And then screen sharing via TeamViewer and AnyDesk. So it's basically one way to it was like a 1-for-1 translation for us from going from in-person mobbing, then when COVID hit, to remote pairing or mobbing, because we were sharing one computer before, like all, around a couple big screen TVs, right? Connected to the same computer. So those went either into the cloud or into a closet, and then we connect into those. And then it feels the same as when we were in person, so to speak, because I'm looking at Pixel Chris instead of actual Chris. And then the driver navigator switch is still pretty seamless because we're all connected to the same machine. So we're basically sharing that same computer, and I just turn off my if I'm controlling or not. And since usually remote computers or hosted in a closet have big network pipes, the upload speed's good. And so I think latency, so that it felt a lot like in-person mobbing. So that's the typical thing you'll see. Yep.
Cool. That makes sense. And how often are you've got your, let's say AnyDesk, right? Your AnyDesk share screen, right? You're all remoted into the same machine. How often are you jumping out of that and going to your own desktop if someone's like, hey, can you look up I don't know how, like, are there situations where you're going back to your own machine to do something, try something out, look something up, and then coming back? Like how does that work?
Yeah, often for me, I have multiple monitors, and so one monitor is the AnyDesk. Usually I use like a mobile device for people's faces and stuff. And then that gives one or two other monitors for research, etc. That's like individual research. We also do mob research, as we were talking about earlier. We're on the shared space, we're researching together. But how about you, Chris?
Yeah, I think all the time. And you know, there might be research, there might be like small level of experimentation or automation. Other things, you know, if I see that the team, you know, while navigating, especially if I'm not the driver, if I see the team while navigating has done something a couple times in a row, I'll start writing a template and then say, you know, paste it in the chat, go ahead and put this in the tool. And so the automationist role from the mob programming RPG a little bit. And you know, so a lot of that, you know, right now, I have one of those nice Samsung curved ultra wide monitors. And Microsoft Power Toys, they have the ability to like redefine screen areas. So you can treat a single very large monitor as many different monitors and have basically hot locations where they will auto size them. So I started using Power Toys a lot to arrange my mobbing. So I'll have like the camera right next to the screen. I have, you know, code base up, research, maybe my laptop monitor has something else on it. And so, yeah, a lot of different tools like that.
That's really cool. So to really give you a sort of panopticon ability to see a lot of different things at the same time.
Yeah, and just like reorganize based on context. I also want to make sure that if I'm doing something other than code, I want to be looking away from the screen. And so, because this is one thing that I think I've learned from just different people that have done remote programming or remote pairing is that generally speaking, you don't want to be like, a lot of people have one monitor with the camera integrated into the monitor. And when you're doing that, you're typing, people don't know if you're talking to them contextually. Especially if you have like a hybrid remote where a couple people are on site, and then which we do have at times. So we do have like an on-site mobbing station that's modeled after the ones that we used to have in our much larger building. And so some people do come on site, or you know, or we'll do like just like allocation activities or whatever. And so sometimes there will be like one or two people online. And so it's really beneficial when you have the visual cue of turning your head to talk, and people see it out of the corner of their eye and stuff like that. So generally speaking, I'll keep the camera and the pictures of people's faces next to each other and away from the code.
That's a great insight, which is very true. Like there's almost like a facial expression I could recognize in people where it's like a sort of dead-eyed, like, you know, like this. But again, if the camera's right there, it sort of looks like you're making quasi eye contact. That's really insightful.
Imagine having a conversation with somebody, but they were looking at you like they look at code while they're concentrating. Right?
Exactly.
Be like,
So this is a minor thing. It might seem pedantic, but it sounds like also chat is part of it, right? Like presumably through Teams, if you're using Teams for AV too. And the reason I'm being a little bit pedantic about that is, like, again, one of the things that's really interesting to me is all the channels of information that are happening concurrently in this. You're that gesture exactly, right? So is it just sort of like you plop things in the chat as people need to see them? Like, is there anybody taking notes formally? I was just part of a mob recently where someone was official note taker, and the chat sort of
Oh,
like
that's
would
interesting.
annotate
Yeah.
when things are happening. Any notion of that, or is it just like chat's like a freewheeling, plop anything in your space?
Well, so for me, it's very much like that. And even with like the navigating the navigator, or just so we kind of have like a loose principle within the group that we want to have everybody speaking over the course of months. We want everybody speaking a roughly equal amount of time. So, that would mean that navigation is, if somebody's really, really technical, they've been coaching other people to be more technical. Maybe they spoke more initially, they're speaking less later. And so if you take that into account, verbalizing code is actually a learned skill, and there are a lot of people that we've hired that have not mobbed or paired before. And so sometimes you just need practice verbalizing code without having to think about what the code does. And so a practice that I'll usually do when I find a situation like that is to chat to them the direction that they need to navigate. And that way they are just working on saying out loud the code that they want, not necessarily thinking about the solution to the problem. So that's like navigating the navigator over chat. So verbal communication. So if you take it the principle of like all code must be verbalized to make it into the code base, then you can use chat certainly as a way to whisper to the other person, right? Because when we were in person, what I would do is while the person was typing the latest instruction from the navigator, I would just, whisper to the driver what I wanted them to do. Chat's a lot more effective because you can be more detailed and you don't have to like be quiet or whatever.
That is absolutely fascinating. And the very notion that like the code has to be verbalized, like that's also a big light bulb for me. Because like I'm drawing the analogy to actual prose, right? Like to me, if I just write something silently, it'll be one way or another. But if I use fresh eyes, look at it and read it aloud, it gains a very different quality, right? They can hear like the rhythm and the prosody and all that stuff. And my assumption, check me on this one, is that verbalizing different bits of code might immediately get you to recognize certain smells of like, oh, this is a really long line. This is a really weird name for this thing. This is whatever, whatever. So do you feel like the actual act of verbalizing inflects how everybody codes?
Yeah, totally. There's a lot. There's a lot to that. I guess what I'll just say is that if you have to say out loud, it's kind of like rubber ducking, right? You're like, you are saying it out loud, and so you get all the benefits of that. But you sort of are listening to yourself, and you're also thinking about, as you're saying the idea, you're getting more comfortable with like saying some, committing to something or to an experiment which you don't know whether it'll pass or fail. And there's a lot of benefit from that where you don't have to be sure of yourself all the time, because we've had, in the past I've run into people where they're just very concerned that they have to be right all the time. And breaking that habit sometimes is really hard for people. And so it helps. Yeah.
Well,
Nice.
this might be a good dovetail. Oh, sorry. Go on. Awesome. Then another
I
question.
was just gonna say, it's been very kind of you to ask us questions and all that kind of stuff, but I'm actually quite curious about Tuple. Are you cool if we pivot to Tuple?
Absolutely.
At least for a little bit.
Yeah.
Maybe this will need a part two, but we'll see. But at least to get the short version, because I guess as a bit of an intro, one thing that I've loved about mob programming is the experimentation with tooling and creating their own tools or using different tools. It's just a hotbed of experimentation, and so I feel like I hear once a month about teams trying new tools or creating their own tool for this or that. And so anytime I hear about a new tool that I don't know hardly anything about, I'm super interested. So I am all ears to hear about Tuple. Yeah. So what is Tuple? What's an intro?
Yeah, for sure. I'm happy to talk your ear off about it. So, like I said, Tuple is a tool that is purpose-built for pairing and mobbing. A little bit of the Tuple origin story. Tuple was founded, I think, maybe about 6, 7 years ago, by 3 people who were working as software engineers. And it's also, it might seem like a minor thing, but it's a bootstrap company. They took their own money to build it because they believed so strongly in the practice of pairing that they were willing to quit their cushy jobs and put their money where their mouth was. And I think since the beginning, the intention was to focus on the dimensions of, at first, pairing, and mobbing came later. It's actually a relatively recent addition, the ability to have calls up to 10 people. But in the beginning, it was really just one-on-one pairing. And the thing that I think drove the founders was the desire to focus on the aspects of pairing that really matter when developers want to get into flow together, right? So, there are generic screen sharing tools. You have Zoom and you have Google Meet and all these things. But I think the things that were really important to them were incredibly sharp, high resolution screen sharing, right? Like this is maybe the most important thing. We have little tiny monospaced fonts. Being able to read everything incredibly legibly is really important. Super low latency, remote control, right? So like really focusing on making that loop as tight as it can be. I think having a really minimal UI has been important since the beginning. Because one of the things that I personally love about Tuple is it has what I would refer to as like a social layer in a way that AnyDesk and TeamViewer I don't think have, where again, you have this like the Slack, for example, you have an idea of like presence, right? And you can see your teammates there. We also have a notion of rooms. So there are virtual spaces that people can be in. And so I think the idea that Tuple is always on, you're always connected, but it's not taking up a lot of real estate is an important one. So it's always there when you need it. And lastly, it's super resource efficient, right? Because as developers, you're always running Docker containers and compilers and IDEs that are enormous. Your every cycle is precious, and so you want to conserve those. And over the last 6-ish years, the team has been laser focused on making Tuple as great at these things as it possibly can be. So this is, to me, as head of product, the thing that, as joining the company, was so apparent. I've worked at a lot of companies where the desire was to do more, go bigger, go wider, and really like try and say, oh, this problem sort of conceptually looks different or looks similar to this other bigger problem. Let's expand our purview and expand our purview. And Tuple, I think, is a product with like a laser focus and a lot of depth. And then over the years, within that, the boundary of the domain, I feel like the team has been able to go really deep and do some things that are really cool that I think are really special with respect to just pairing and mobbing. So one of the cool things that Tuple does that I'll plug is it's a feature called App Veil. So App Veil is the way to permanently exclude windows from ever being shared, right? So again, a common paradigm. Another thing that Tuple does really well that I'll also plug is it's very easy to go back and forth with who's sharing, right? Again, I think it's very cumbersome with Zoom and Meet. It's one click to switch whose screen is front and center. The thing you don't want to do is say like, oh, I've got the doc page. Let me bring it up for you. You want to take control and your iMessage is right next to your window and suddenly everyone's looking at your text message with your best buddies from high school. That can be really embarrassing. So again, there's a lot of like technical magic under the hood to make this possible. But this is another scenario that, again, all of us as programmers, as pair programmers, and now as mob programmers have encountered was being embarrassed by this. And the team went deep to figure out a cool solution. And there it is. So there's like a laundry list of cool little features that Tuple has that I think facilitate the experience I like to think that it's as good as it could be. And obviously room for improvement, obviously things that are not perfect, but that's Tuple in a nutshell. So I'll pause there. If you guys have any further questions on that.
Yeah, I think I'll double down on the importance of kind of some of the latency things that mobbing and pairing starts to feel clunky and people start to drop off if it starts to, I like the analogy, I'm trying to think of the book it came from. I think it came from the UI UX community, but it's kind of the analogy of like opening a door. Like if I go to open the door and I turn the knob and then 10 seconds later, the door is able to be opened, right? Like,
Yeah.
like the feedback loop between me doing a thing and it being responsive. If it's past a certain amount of time, my brain thinks that my hand is unrelated to whatever happened afterwards, right? And so there, I've been in mobbing and pairing sessions where the tools fail in that regard, and then it just starts to get really confusing. Like I think everyone is very confused about what's happening, and then it makes it hard to be effective at it. And so the fact that you guys have doubled down on that is quite encouraging because that is essential for it to be speedy. And I think I think Chris, I think in one of our live mobbing episodes that happened to someone. So there's a live demo of someone being out of sync with the rest of the mob. Like they were seeing, you know, a function that was created 30 seconds ago showing up on their screen right now and was in a different universe than we were. And so, yeah.
It's kind of interesting. A lot of the times the teams have kind of grown accustomed to looking at the timer. It's like, oh, the timer's not counting down, or the seconds are moving slower than I would expect. And then you can kind of figure out how to bail yourself out of that. And so, yeah, and having a smart screen sharing solution where you can hide tabs or hide, different pieces of functionality is also, certainly a good thought. It is, is the tool being used currently? Like, is it in production? Is it something that's been under development? Like what level of interaction do people have with it right today?
Yeah, no, it's definitely in production. You can sign up for an account if you want to. You get 10 free calls, but we have tens of thousands of developers using it. Big companies. Again, I don't want to blow up anyone's spot, but we'll be making a new website soon. We'll have lots of logos on there. So companies you know and love, lots of people using it. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. If you guys didn't have any more, well, did you have any more questions for me? And if not, I had another thing about Tuple that I was curious about, but I know I've been hogging the mic. So any other questions?
We've got 4 more minutes. Why don't you go ahead and ask?
I'll share my
do it.
So these are the two there, in preparing for this episode, I was thinking about things that could be fun to talk about. And I kind of wanted to share 2 of the things that I'm personally thinking about for Tuple, right? Now that I've given you sort of a lay of the land, I want to see how these like land with you. See if they feel like, nah, maybe not so much, or see if they have any resonance with you. But one thing I'm really cognizant of, and I wish we could have a part 2 because I'm really curious about this for you guys as well, is the sort of the social, psychological, and logistical barriers to pairing and mobbing. And I think this may apply more to pairing than mobbing. My guess is it sounds like your organization especially has a bunch of formal structures to encourage mobbing. But I think, one of the things that I'm also really curious about is this transition from being IRL to being remote and hybrid, right?
Sure.
And I personally am really cognizant of all of the social rituals that we lost and those subtle things, right? Eye contact, you're at your desk. I can see that you look busy. You don't look busy. You're staring off into space. I can say, hey, can we do this? And I feel like as we've moved to remote work, that really informal way of knowing what's going on with people and also then finding time to work with them has really gone by the wayside. And so this is one thing that I'm personally really curious about for Tuple is, do you guys have thoughts about this? Is this like a thing that you've thought about in your organization? I think you may have encountered in like the move from IRL to hybrid.
Well, so there's tons of thoughts. We probably should just do a part 2 and just have that as part of a thing. I mean, it's good. I couldn't answer the question in 2 minutes, I'm pretty sure. And so why don't we just schedule a deep dive and maybe we'll close it out right here and we'll come back next time. So to our audience, please leave comments about how you felt about some of the things said in this episode. Any conflict is good conflict on the YouTube channel. And to Eli, thanks for joining us. And to everybody out there, we'll see you all next time. And look out for episode 2. All right, bye, everybody.
See you.